Okay, so now we're gonna mix the plaster. I put 3 coats of the mold soap, okay, or hand soap with a little bit of water in there. Remember that other list of things. If you don't have the hand soap around, you can use dish soap. You can use Murphy's oil soap. You can use Vaseline if need be. You can use cooking oil. Any kind of cooking oil will do. Doesn't matter. Lots of different options for what we can use for a mold release. If you're using something like cooking oil or you're using Vaseline, you don't need to wait for those things to dry, and you probably don't need to put 3 coats of them on there. Really, that's for more if you're doing Murphy oil soap, or if you're doing the hand soap or the dish soap kind of system. You want to get a little bit of that liquid out of there that's there, and you want to wait for it to dry. So I've waited for this to dry as well. I also even used a hair dryer and kind of sped things up a little bit so I can get it to dry a little bit quicker, okay? So now I've got a thing of water. I've put this around half. I don't know if you guys can see inside of there, but I've got about half of this filled because as I fill the plaster, it's going to start to rise up, and I want it to be pretty full at the end of this because I'm looking at the size of what this is and how much I'm going to need for this, right? And how much I have in this cup. Now, here's the other thing, is if you think you need a little bit more than that, you could do 2 at the same time, which I think is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to get a little bit more water in this guy, and then go from there. You know, if you have a bigger container, you can do a bigger container. You always want to err on the side of having a little bit too much left over, and then you just leave it in the cup, let it cure in the cup, and then you can toss the cup, all right? Remember, we're not putting this down any drains. We're not doing anything like that, okay? That's what we're going to essentially end up doing right now. So I'm going to set this stuff aside. I've got my plaster. I'm going to get a little bit more water, all right? I've also got some stir sticks here. Remember, those are the chopsticks that I talked about. That'd be great, all right? The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get myself this. I have this bucket, okay? And this bucket I'm going to fill up with a good amount of water, and I'm going to have a little bit of a sponge nearby, so that way if I need to clean anything up, I can do so and have a large container of water. That's essentially what this is going to be. You want this to be a container, either the container that I gave you here at school, or you want to have this container be something that you don't care about. You don't want to use like a nice bowl or anything like that. If this gets ruined, it gets ruined. We can throw it away. All right. We don't want to use anything that you know is important, or that's expensive, or that is dishware that you're going to be using on a regular basis, because sometimes plaster is very difficult to get out of things. We don't want to have to go and chip away at china, essentially, or some sort of ceramic object to get that stuff out of there. We want to make sure that we have a container that is either you know, disposable, or something that's from the garage that's used more for this type of work rather than any sort of kitchen stuff, okay? So I'm gonna have that. I also have this is a throwaway one. It doesn't matter what you use to get the plaster out of the plaster bag. You can even use your hand to scoop it out if you want to. If you're gonna use your hand to scoop it out, what I do when I'm putting my hands in plaster is I take Vaseline and I rub Vaseline all over my hands, and then I do that. That protects my hands from drying out too much and absorbing a little bit of that plaster. But if you have anything, even a ladle or a small scoop from the kitchen, the powdery portion of this is not going to stay on this kind of stuff, right? We can then wash it afterwards, tap it off and then wash it, and that's going to be just fine, all right? So that's not going to play into, you know, like ruin anything like this would, okay? Like using a big bowl that's a nice salad bowl or something like that. Don't want to do that. Use something that's disposable that you don't care about. Sound good? All right, I'm going to go and get the water that I need, and then we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to talk about how we mix plaster, which is very important. Now I've got my big bucket of water right here. I want to make sure that I've got this. This is just cleanup. This is a just-in-case deal, right? The whole idea behind this is it's a lot of water, and if there's a lot of water and I need to pick up a little bit of plaster, having a lot of water will make it so that the plaster will not set up, all right? In order for plaster to be set up properly, it has to have the right ratio, and it has to generate heat. And if there's enough water in here to cool it down, which is enough in this big bucket, then that powder, that plaster powder, will never turn to a hard plaster. Okay, so I've got my 2 containers here. I've got a couple of stir sticks in case I need to. I've got my bag of plaster here. Now, this is one of the most important things about plaster, is that we make sure that we only ever add plaster to water. We don't add water to plaster, right? That is not how it works. We want to make sure that it goes that way, all right? Because that's how we get the proper mix. So what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start taking a little scoop here. And if you want, you can wear some sort of a mask. Even the mask that you've probably been wearing during these times will work out fine. And it's just to keep the particulate matter down, because sometimes this stuff, but the thing about plaster, it's pretty heavy, right? So because it's pretty heavy, it doesn't really become that airborne. And if we're really careful about how we handle it, then it doesn't really become that airborne ever anyways. So what I'm going to do when I add this is I'm going to slowly kind of sprinkle it around, okay? Like this. Make sure that I get it into the corners. And you see that it kind of dissipates into, we don't want to just take a big scoop and just plop, scoop it in there, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, right? Because I think I'm going to need 2 of these to get this all set. And I'm a bigger fan of using my hand rather than using the scooper, but I wanted you guys to see that just in case. Another good idea, remember we talked about using something, like a pizza box. We can take this, actually, I didn't even think about this until just now because I'm here in the studio, is taking this and putting something down underneath, so that way if we have any kind of extra fallout, then we don't end up having any issues, okay? Get this position right so you guys can see it. There we go. You can also even maybe use a smaller scoop. I was using kind of a bigger scoop. We don't need that big of a scoop to do anything with. But again, we don't want to plop this stuff in. Like, I like to use my fingers like this, because then I can kind of break it up a little bit with my fingers as all of this goes in there. So I keep adding this, right? I'm adding about the same amount in each container each time that I do it. So that way they're about the same, right? Now, we keep adding this until we start to see islands form on the top of the plaster, right? Right now we don't see any islands forming. We see kind of islands happening right there, but then within a couple of seconds they disappear, okay? See how helpful the pizza box is here, because it's kind of keeping in control all the little bits of plaster that kind of fall out between my fingers. And I also like to use my fingers like this too, because I can break it up a little bit better so I don't have clumps. The water level is rising in each one of these cups as I do it, and that's supposed to happen because I'm adding more material inside of there, right? So as I add more material within there, that water level should rise inside of my cup. So once we get to a point where we start to see there's an island right there, see? But within, 3 seconds or less, it's gone. We want it to last much longer than that, all right? And because I'm using this pizza box now, I can be a little bit more haphazard with the way I use the material. You don't need to sift plaster too crazily. Oh, now I'm getting some islands happening here. See how they're lasting a little bit longer? So we're getting close. There are all sorts of theories about plaster. This one's a little bit behind, so I'm going to add one more scoop over here. Seems like it's disappearing a little bit quicker on that side, so I'm going to kind of get it back in line. We're still seeing the islands completely disappear, which means we're not quite there yet. But there's a couple of different theories about plaster mixing to get a good consistency. But the easiest one to follow is this method that I'm talking about, where we keep adding plaster to water, never adding water to plaster. And while I'm doing this, I'm waiting for those islands to form. There are ways to measure this stuff out as well, but it's not necessary, especially for the type of plaster mold we're making. When I'm making slip casting molds in ceramics, I use a different formula. I use a weight of plaster to a certain measurement of water. And so now I've got islands. You see those islands? They're staying, right? So what I'm going to do, now that they're staying there, I'm going to let these sit for about 3 minutes, okay? And just let them sit and don't agitate it at all. Just let it sit here. Even though we have some that looks like, I don't want to agitate it too much. I can push the dry stuff in there, but I want to let it sit, right? I can use maybe even my chopstick to get anything off the rim and get it inside of there. This is the proper amount of plaster to water to get a good mix. Now this plaster is going to go through a couple of phases. And I'm not really even timing right now, but you should time it, okay? And when you time it, you should time this first phase for about 3 minutes, okay? I'm going to pause this and I'm going to come back to it, but we're waiting 3 minutes right now so that all the water can saturate into the plaster, right? All that dry plaster that's in there. You can even see on these islands it's starting to crack. Over on this one, we're starting to see almost all of it be wet, but I'm not mixing it. You don't want to mix it, because as soon as I start to agitate and mix this plaster, that's when it's going to start to set up. It takes some time for it to set up, okay? I've got a book somewhere that talks about exactly the different phases that plaster goes through as it's being mixed. Right now it's just kind of wet plaster, so we would let this sit and soak for about 3 minutes. I'm going to go to the sink and wash my hand off, or I could even come here to the blue bucket. You can't see it because it's a little bit off screen, but I can use that blue bucket. And then I've got a shop towel here, and I'm going to use that shop towel to dry my hands off. That way I don't have to go anywhere, but we can talk a little bit more about plaster while we wait. And so after 3 minutes, then we're going to start to mix it. We'll start mixing it, and then as we start mixing it is when it's going to start to set up. And as soon as we get it mixed up, we're going to mix it for about a minute. And then once we mix it for about a minute, we're going to then pour it into our mold. And we do that instantly. And it's going to be a liquid when we do that. We want it to be liquid, all right? There's another stage of plaster dryness that's called thixotropic. That happens about after the mixing phase, maybe after about 12 minutes to 15 minutes, depending. And as you can see while we're sitting here talking now, this one over here, this one, all of that plaster is all now wet, right? This one, we still see a little bit of cracking right here. Probably just in another minute or so is when we're going to start mixing. And I haven't started to do anything with this stuff that's left on the bottom. Obviously, I'm using a pizza container that still has a bunch of junk in it. If you had cleaned it out a little bit, maybe you could, manage this plaster and keep it for a later, time or whatever. But we don't need to worry that much about it. I'm just going to close the pizza lid and put it in the trash can. So here we are. We're back. We've waited. These have now had enough time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start mixing them. I'm going to start mixing them together. And remember, we said we're going to mix them for about a minute. And we want to mix them for a long period of time like that, for about a minute, because we want to make sure that we really get this stuff mixed up, right? And we can use anything. I'm using these chopsticks as my mixing sticks. And I don't have to use something like this. I can just use a little small stick. I could use a paint stick that's free from Home Depot. Those are a little bit on the bigger side, I would say. So using something smaller would probably be a little bit easier. Maybe a big tongue depressor or something like that, or a big popsicle stick. Any of those kinds of things could be used, all right? So we're just making sure that we really mix this up nicely. and get everything as mixed up as we possibly can. And then we're going to move over to the pouring phase. All right, so everything's looking good so far. Everything feels nice and liquidy still, which is what we want. The plaster that we're using it's called a pottery plaster. There's not really a big difference between a lot of plasters, except for you do have some varying degrees of like quality, essentially. But for a pottery plaster, it's just kind of a lower quality plaster. It's not like a plaster of Paris, or there's another kind of plaster that's out there that's called Ultra Cal. And Ultra Cal is just dries a bit harder, and it's awfully white. It makes a very, very white color. This makes a kind of grayish white color. You know, there's all these different hues essentially of white. So it's been about a minute now that we've been mixing these. I've been moving the sticks up and down, in and out essentially of these containers, and now we're going to get to the pouring phase. So what I'm going to do, since we're using the camera, and I don't want to move the camera, I'm just going to slide this over so we can see our mold. All right, now we're going. We've still got liquid. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come right above this, and I'm going to pour right over top of that item that we want to cast, and kind of go around it like this, just so I can make sure that I've got everything in there nicely. And I'm going to pour that all the way in. I'm not going to try and clean out this cup. I don't need to clean off the stick, but if I want to, I can take this and use this kind of slightly wet or really wet sponge to kind of sponge it off just really easily, and put that back into the blue bucket, give it a squeeze, so that all that plaster dissipates in the water. Okay, and then I'm going to move over to my second container now, and I'm going to get some of that in there, and I'm going to come close to the top, but I'm going to watch everywhere that I'm pouring it, make sure that I don't go over the edge, and bam, 2 of those was perfect. Okay, all right, it's going to get a nice robust mold that I can push down into. Right, again, we're going to just set those 2 aside. I'm going to clean off my other stick so I've got it ready to go. That way I can reuse these things, right? Especially these the kind that I have here, like a bamboo one. Those are a bit nicer. They last a little bit longer than the pine ones. The softwood ones, they get a lot of splinters on them. So if I clean them off, I can use them again. All right, so here we are. Now what I want to do, see, I spilled a little bit, not a big deal. Just leave it. Or if you want, you can get that sponge and kind of just sponge off the edge. Go into that bucket of water that has a lot of water in it. Kind of clean off this area. But what we want to do is we want to agitate the whole mold. And we want to do that so we can get some of the maybe air bubbles out of there. This clay that we're using as the wall, we're not going to reuse this clay. It's going to go into the garbage when we're finished. All right, so I'm going to kind of just get it off the edge so it's easy for me to deal with later. And what I'm going to do is kind of just give it a little shake. Okay, I can also kind of give some taps to this on the side, and I'm watching to see if any air bubbles kind of come to the surface. What we want, there's little bitty ones coming to the surface, and that's fine, right? That's going to give us an idea that some of that air that might have been trapped down there is actually moving its way to the top. All right, that's better than having all that air down in the mold, especially right next to our object that we're trying to cast. All right, now we sit and wait. It's going to take from the time that we finish stirring till the time that we can demold, meaning we can take all of this clay wall and everything off. That's going to take about 30 minutes. So you can set a timer and come back to it. And at about 20 minutes, you're going to start to feel quite a bit of heat, right? At about 25 minutes, you're going to feel a lot of heat, and it's going to be pretty hard. And then at 30 minutes, it's going to start to kind of do the cooling process. So it's going to start to cool down a little bit, but you'll feel it. You'll feel it generate some heat. All right. So we'll come back to this in a moment so we can demold. Okay, here we are, moment of truth. Remember how, and you'll notice this when you make yours and do yours and pour your plaster, you'll notice that when you first pour it that it's got a shine from all the lights that are above and everything, so it's reflecting light. And right now we have no reflection of light, and if I touch this, it feels solid, okay? It's been more than 30 minutes. You probably want to wait at least 30 to take it out of the mold, maybe a little bit longer. And one indicator too is if you've got, you've got these cups, right? And so if you take a look at this cup, right, all of that is, has still that, it's not reflecting light, it's not shiny, but watch this. If I squeeze the cup, all the plaster becomes little chunks in there, okay? So these are now trash, right? We just toss those in the trash, and bada boom, bada bing. Now we need to demold this thing, right? So we've got our clay walls, and we left this as wet clay. So if I start taking this and I start removing it from the outside here, I can pull off that whole clay wall. See how nicely it comes off, right? This clay, a couple of things we can do with it, What I like to do, if we were in the studio, we'd have a bin of it, and it would just be plaster clay. So it would be clay that we would use to make these kind of clay walls and do plaster projects. At home, you can do the same thing, but what you don't want to do is take this and then reuse it as regular clay if you're into ceramics or making ceramic stuff, okay? This is not usable anymore. These little bits of plaster, they can kind of take on moisture and do weird things to the clay when it goes into a kiln. So you don't want to reuse it for that in that sense. It does get kind of dry just in the process because it's out for such a long period of time, but it can be re-wet and it can be reused if you so choose. But again, we don't want to use it for the same thing, all right? What I'm going to do is take a little scraper or a knife tool or something, and it's nice to do this now because the plaster hasn't hardened up all the way, all right? So I'm just kind of going around and I'm getting rid of any of this extra little edge that's really sharp, all right? Just like so. And the other thing I like to do is I like to give it a little bit of a beveled edge. So I come in here at about a 45-degree angle and start going around the object. I believe I gave you guys one of these in your loaner tools. You can also use a paring knife, but not one that you would use in the kitchen because it might dull it. You can also use a fettling knife, which is a clay tool. And just give it a beveled edge. Giving it that beveled edge just makes it a little bit safer while you're handling it. Gives it a nicer look to the mold, a little bit more of a clean edge, right? And now what I do is that, and look, this is exactly what we want to happen. This stayed down in there. It released beautifully from the mold, okay? And now we have this small little half circle that's here that we can use. You don't want to touch it too much because again, this is still a little bit on the soft side, right? That's as perfect as we could get it to release as possible. We didn't even get any of the clay color onto this surface of the plaster, okay? Which is awesome, right? Sometimes the clay will kind of stain it, and then we wash it a little bit to get it a little bit more clean. And so now I've got myself a nice little press mold that I can make objects with. And we'll have a separate video of where I show you how to press the clay down in there, and we'll talk about how to use the Sculpey, right? And then obviously what we can do with this is just pop that out, and if everything went well, right, I can just clean this thing off, put it back into my beach toolkit so I can have my smash ball available to me, give it a little bit of a wash in the sink, bada boom, bada bing, right? We didn't even destroy this object, which is great. That's perfect. And then this clay, we can just peel this right up off of Jason's board. Thank you, Jason, again. And again, it's got some plaster in it. I get most of the chunks and things away from it. But then we can put it, again, with that chunk of clay and we can use this later as plaster clay. I'll put it in a separate bag, mark it, or put it in a bin and mark it, so that way I can continue to use it. But like I said, again, you may end up just be putting this stuff in the trash, but if you get yourself a separate bag, and if you're looking for it, or if you want to bring it into the studio at the end of the semester, we will take that plaster clay as well. We just want it marked. Okay? Excellent, gang. So that's how we make a simple one-part mold. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you guys have fun with it.